If you're kind of new at engraving tumblers, or you're just finding you're running into some trouble here and there, we're going to talk about that. Different types of tumblers, how I engrave them on the bolt, including full wraps, today on LaserNut. Yeah, apologize for the mess. I'm doing a number of different rearrangements, running some new electrical and things in the garage here. But I've had a lot of questions about things I do when I'm engraving tumblers on my bolt. And I know I've dropped a few things that I've learned to do ad hoc through a number of videos. So I thought I'd just put it all into one. We'll call it Tumbler Basics. As many of you know, I'm not an expert, but I wanted to try to put everything into one video. There's a number of different shapes or types of tumblers or drinkware that you're going to encounter or you're going to want to sell and engrave. And so I thought I'd just combine everything into one video for you folks, especially if you're new to lasers or you just got your Thunderbolt and you want to start doing tumblers. I'll try to keep it concise, so let's get at it. So for the video today, we're using my Thunder laser bolt, 30 watt RF laser. I'm going to be using drinkware from Grosche International, and I've got a PiBurn GRIP too. So let's talk about some essentials. You're going to need a rotary first of all. I happen to have PiBurn GRIPs. I love them. But there are a number of different manufacturers. There's grip style rotaries, there's also roller type rotaries. And what you choose, I guess, is a personal decision. And I think everything today is going to work or at least be reasonably applicable to either or whatever brand you have. You're going to need things to clean your tumblers. You're going to want Dawn Power Wash. You're going to want a soft sponge. And I know a lot of people will use LA Awesome or other type chemicals or a magic eraser. And I'll explain to you why I seldom ever use the magic eraser or anything harsher than this Dawn Power Wash. Must have, you gotta have a caliper. You're gonna need a level. You may want masking tape in your testing phase. And you're gonna need measuring tapes, not just your regular standard type tape, but remember that all of these tumblers are convex, which means you can't measure in a linear fashion. So you may wanna get a tailor's tape. It's what my grandmother, my grandfather had. It's a soft measuring tape, but it allows you to wrap around or along the tumbler. Because remember, the tumbler is not linear or flat. So these are super helpful. If you're looking to do full wraps on these big 40 ounce or tumblers or travelware that has a very severe taper to it, you're going to need something that measures degrees. So you can pick up one of these digital level boxes, which will measure angles or degrees. Or if you don't have one and you have an iPhone, there's an app in there for measuring, and in that measurement app, there's also an actual level. So you can just put your phone on it. Not as precise, of course, especially if you have a case, but it'll give you a good idea. So let's begin with what I'd call a very familiar looking travel mug. This is a 20 ounce. They generally maintain this shape. You've got a slight taper till you get here right around just past the middle. You'll have a severe taper and then a slow taper again. We'll talk about full wraps in a few minutes. Let's assume you're just going to do a logo or you're doing a design and you're going to use the top part of this mug. We've got some paper and a pen. I'm going to take the diameter measurement at the top. I'm going to take the diameter here at the bottom of where my design will end. And I'm going to measure my engravable space. And I'm going to capture that on paper, mainly because I won't remember. I know that this has a press-on lid, which means there's no threading on the inside of this cup. So I'm going to grip it using my small little rubber fingers from the inside. The longer ones will bypass this ridge, so that's why I use the short ones. That allows me clearance now to come up close to the very edge at the top of the cup with my grip. Let's jump into Lightburn. Here in Lightburn, I've created my design. I've already measured my travel mug, so I know the length up and down of how much room I have to work with along that taper. I have my upper diameter, I'd call it, and my lower diameter from the top of the cup to where my design stops down that taper. You'll also see that my rotary menu here is turned green, which tells me that the rotary is plugged in, and it is. I'm going to roll up into my rotary, open up that menu, and you'll see here I have a chuck style, so I've clicked chuck, I've enabled the rotary, it's on the A axis, which is correct for my bolt. I've already put in my steps per rotation, which is specific to the type of rotary you're using and the manufacturer. And what I need to do is I need to put a diameter in here for the tumbler. But you're thinking, GP, I've got two different diameters. I have the higher diameter up at the top of the cup, and I also have the diameter measurement down at the bottom of that taper. What you want to put in here is your biggest diameter measurement. Because remember, that diameter combined with the steps per rotation is what Lightburn and your laser are going to use to determine how fast that rotary spins while you're engraving. You don't want to put anything but the highest, and in this case, on this type of travel mug, the biggest diameter is at the top of the mug. So that's what we're going to input here. The second thing, which is a bit of a mistake I made for a long time, is I kind of rounded off. So if I bought tumblers and it said it was a 3.5 inch diameter, I'd put 3.5 inches in there. But there actually is no 3.5 inch tumbler. It's never exactly 3.5 inches. But what I learned over time is that you can't round your measurement when you input it here to the rotary setup. You need to be pretty precise. In my case, that bolt is incredibly precise. But remember, the engraving is only going to be as accurate as you are. So I've learned over time that I always go to at least 2, often 3 decimal places on that diameter when I use my calipers, because it matters. And the reason this is so critical is because all the calculations are done based on this input. And especially when you start to branch out and you want to start doing full wraps on tumblers, you'll be scratching your head trying to figure out why the full wrap is not meeting on the other side of the tumbler. It's because you haven't put exact measurements in here. So I always go at least 2, normally 3 decimal places on that diameter measurement. So we'll jump into this box here. My upper diameter was 3.436 inches. And as always, the circumference is automatically calculated by the rotary setup. But what that also tells you when it comes time to do a full wrap, when you're going to want this circumference measurement right here, because that's going to be the key to making your entire wrap meet from the start to the finish around that tumbler. So my rotary is set up. It's green, which tells me it's connected and it's reading from the controller. I have my design. Usually right here, I'd go into my material library and I would update my settings for how I wanted to engrave that particular cup and color, because you're going to find that some colors don't respond the same to the wavelength of your laser as others do. So you may find yourself with different settings for some of the colors you get. She's updated. I take a look at this. I have no logos or anything circular, so I don't have to worry about adjusting width, which we'll talk about shortly. But I do know that I have a length of only 2.5 inches, which means that this logo currently up here is sitting at a height of 2.9, and that means that I'm going to exceed my engrave area in the top taper of that mug. So I'm going to come up here to the top, and I'm going to drop this down to 2.5 inches in height. And now I know that the width, of course, will also be 2.76 now, because I've left my aspect ratio locked, because I don't want to skew or stretch the design. So my height is good, everything else looks good, but because I'm working on a tapered travel mug instead of one that is cylindrical and has the same diameter throughout, I like using this taper warp function. If you come up here to your laser tools menu and come down, you'll see the very bottom here is taper warp, and that function works very well. And what it does, if you put in your calculations or your measurements, it will try to skew your design such that it comes out looking square or proper as opposed to stretched or lengthened or shortened. It's in millimeters. Not sure why some of this is in inches and some is in millimeters. Probably a setting I should do. And you'll remember we took a top diameter. I converted that top diameter to 87.05 millimeters. And you'll see in the background my design keeps changing. I know that my length is 63.33 millimeters. So your top diameter and your bottom diameter are relative to the top and bottom of where your design is going on the mug, not the physical mug or tumbler itself. My bottom diameter is 84.52. I put that in there and we click OK. So now the taper warp function should do its job when you wrap it on that tumbler. I'm going to be grabbing it into the chuck rotary from the top, so I know that I need to spin this design 90 degrees to the right. My user origin, I often will set it here, my green dot, I'll often set to a corner. Sometimes I set it in the middle. It's whatever you feel more comfortable with as to how you want to frame it and make sure that it sits exactly where you want it. So that being said, the rotary setup, my design is set up, it's sized correctly. I always take a look at it to make sure it's going to come out the way I want it, and it does. You've put your settings in and you're good to go, and send it to the bolt. So if you're using a tapered mug or a tapered tumbler, those are kind of my key basic steps. If you're working with drinkware that's cylindrical, in other words, your diameter doesn't change from the top to the bottom, then you don't use taper warp, because there's no taper for it to try to consider or to try to revise on your design. It will sit and it'll come across the way it's supposed to. If you're working with drinkware that has a screw-in lid, that means you're going to have threads on the inside, which means you shouldn't try to grip from the inside. Because if you use those rubber fingers, whether you're using the long ones or the short ones, and you tighten that grip up, the threads are most likely going to dig into the rubber, and you're not going to get a very firm grip on it. So in that case, I always grip from the outside. And if you're doing an engrave kind of in the middle, I can use the fingers and I can grip from the outside. And I'll usually, in this case, because of the severe taper to it, I'll always grab from the biggest end. I always want to be careful or mindful of whatever type of grip, whether it's rollers, those rubber silicone fingers, I guess they are, or however it is I'm gripping it. I have to remember that the laser head is always going to need time to slow down, drop, and speed up again, which means if I've got this type of an engrave, I would not use those round cylindrical silicone fingers, because I know, at least in the case of the bolt, that laser head is going to hit those when it comes past and tries to slow down. And that, of course, will depend on what type of laser you have. In the case of the bolt, it auto-focuses, and I have an autofocus mechanism in the back, and that mechanism will for sure hit it. But your laser may not have that. You may use one of those tools for measuring your focal length, and you may be able to either, lift it high enough, a little bit out of focus to pass, or it may pass it altogether. In my case, for these type of applications, my PiBurn GRIP has these very low profile L fingers, and they work great for me in the bolt because it's low profile enough that the laser head will go right across the top of it without any collision. If I've got a tumbler or drinkware where I have the threading on the outside, such as this, I'm going to grab it from the back. And similarly, when I'm grabbing from the back, that means that instead of taking my design and spinning it 90 degrees to the right in Lightburn, I'm going to spin it 90 degrees to the left, because I'm in essence kind of engraving backwards, so to speak, on the tumbler. So, everybody's favorite, full wraps. Bit of a challenge. So let's talk about full wraps on a same diameter type straight tumbler. This guy here in particular, full wrap all the way around. Same size diameter, simple autofocus procedure, your regular set your origin, frame it, all those good things. I used my low profile L-shaped fingers to grab from the bottom because I have an inset threaded top to it. A little bit different. And that's why you'll see I didn't take my design all the way to the bottom, because I couldn't. Do you remember earlier we talked about how important it was to get that exact diameter to at least 2 decimal places, or maybe 3. If you open up your rotary window or your rotary setup, you'll recall that when you put that exact diameter in, you get an exact circumference. 10.794 inches around. That's your circumference, from one spot all the way around to meet the other. And it's shocking how exact it is. So now, because you've put such an exact diameter in, you're going to get an exact circumference, give or take 100th or 1,000th of a decimal place. So now that I know that exact circumference right to the 3rd decimal place, I can either grab my line tool and create a line, Or what I like to do is I'll grab my rectangle here and I'm going to create a rectangle. And I'm going to make it super thin because I don't need it to be wide. This is a test strip. I'm going to come up here, unlock my aspect ratio, and I'm going to make the width of that line exactly what the circumference was, 10.794, I believe it was. Then I'm going to lock my aspect back. I'm going to make sure it's a fill mode, not a line, and I'm going to set a really high setting, like 800, 900 millimeters per second for speed, and a really low power setting of, maybe 10%. My LPI can be 200 or 250, doesn't matter, because all I want to do is I want to see if the beginning and the end of those lines line up on this tumbler from start to finish, or if they overlap. A lot of people don't want to waste inventory, so they'll often use masking tape, and they'll wrap masking tape around it, and then you're going to throw it into your laser, and then you're going to send that file to the laser, fire up the laser, get your tumbler in there, and then you're going to watch it do this line all the way around. Running a test wrap like this with a line will give you confirmation of where the laser starts and whether or not it finishes exactly where it should, or if it overlaps. And what I found is if you're really precise with that diameter, it virtually will be bang on. You might be off by 1/100th of a decimal place, but you'll see it'll come together and there won't be much overlap or gap. It's very precise, and the bolt is very precise. So that's how I do it. And you'll see here, I kind of didn't believe myself, so I adjusted that number. And of course it overlapped the first time, but it came together the second time because I just put the circumference in and it came out perfectly. Again, this is a straight canister. There's no taper to it. That gets a little more difficult. We'll get to that in a second. So now that I've got the exact circumference, I'm going to begin building my design with that exact height in Lightburn, and I'm going to work my design around it, keeping in mind how much length I have to deal with. So how did I get my design to miss the branding on the side of this tumbler? Let me show you. So I'm going to start and finish my design around either left or right or in the center of this branding. But I have to adjust the design so it doesn't run across that branding. And that's where this handy tailor's tape comes in, or seamstress tape. I'm going to identify where I want to start the top of my design, and I'm going to simply measure from there 5.5 inches or whatever it happens to be to where the bottom of my design is, and you'll see it comes to here. I'm then going to take the measurement from side to side and from here to the top, and then I'm going to jump into Lightburn. I'm just going to take, this is just a sample design, and let's say this is going to be the wrap on my tumbler. I know that the top is here. I already know this distance, and I know that that circular branding is going to come in here. It's going to hit part of the side here, and it's also going to come in and hit part of the side here. So whether you use a square or a circle or any type of shape, I'm going to grab a shape, and let's, for example, say it's a rectangle. I'm going to make this rectangle exactly half of the size of what I measured on that. So let's just say it was 1 inch by 1 inch, just for ease. I'm going to drop this down. I'm going to make it 1/2 inch because I need to do this on either side. And I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to grab one and I'm going to put it at the very bottom here. And I'm going to put one and I'm going to put it at the very bottom here of the design. If I want to be really precise, I can grab these, all three of them. I can come up here and I can go to my horizontal alignment tool and I can align the bottoms. Now I know these two blocks are at the very bottom of my design. And now we're going to use our Boolean command. I'm going to grab this guy, I'm going to shift, and I'm going to grab my design. I'm going to come up to tools, and I'm going to go to my Boolean assistant, and I believe the subtract b minus a works, and it does. So you'll see here on the left side, I've now taken out that design. And I'm going to do the exact same thing here on the right. I'm going to shift, grab both, go to my Boolean assistant, and I'm going to subtract b minus a. And now I've removed the design that's going to otherwise overlap with that branding at the bottom of the tumbler. And now when I wrap it, it's going to wrap around that design. It's not going to print or engrave over it. And you can do that anywhere. Perhaps I want to put some words, you know, in the middle of that design somewhere. I'm going to grab my rectangle. I'm going to run it over because that's how big I want my words. And I'm going to shrink it down as much as I can. So now I know the size of my rectangle, or what it should be. And let's drop it right here in the middle of this design. I'm going to highlight that, highlight my design, go to my Boolean Assistant under Tools. I'm going to subtract B from A, and now I've created a space where I can put my words right in the middle. So there may be a better or more efficient way, but so far that's what I've learned to do, and it's worked really well. And as you can see here, I probably should have adjusted my cloud because it kind of caught the side of the G, but you'll notice I totally missed that bottom branding, and I have a connected full wrap right along the seam. So yeah, the 40 ounce. Save the best for the last. You're going to need to remove the handle first and foremost. There's just usually 2 screws. They're usually hex screws, and in this case it's a 2.5. I think that's pretty standard. There's a screw under here and there's one here, and you just simply remove them and get the handle off. The handle slides off, and you'll see there are 2 mounts here. One thing I've learned the hard way is you don't want to bend these mounts down. Leave them where they are. That's better. I don't think they're welded. I think they're cemented in there, and if you bend them too many times, you're going to misshapen them, and you're going to have a hard time to get the handle on, or you're actually going to snap one of them right off. So you've got to leave them straight up the way they stand. I've noticed in a lot of YouTubes when people are doing this, I see that their tabs are bent in because they're trying to get more focus, but I just would highly recommend for the cost of these that you don't bend them. So now we're going to do a full wrap on this big guy, and you'll notice he has a slight taper, sharp taper, slight taper. Same thing, the measurements you're going to use in Lightburn, you're going to take your diameter at the top for your upper and your diameter at the bottom, and you're going to measure the length. So in my case, I'm going to use this spot right here at the end of the branding as the top of my design, or you can simply measure it if you don't and know exactly where it is you're going to start, so you know how long your design is. Depending on the type of design, you're going to need to use taper warp. Remember, we need the top, the bottom, and the length. And that will adjust your design so that it tries to account for all of this tapering. Some designs you won't need to, and I can't specify yet. I've only done a few, but I've noticed sometimes I'll come together, and at some point it might not totally come together, and if I taper warp on others, it keeps it together all the way down. Remember, you've got 3 different tapers to deal with here. So top, bottom, length. But here's where things get interesting. So I'm going to try to bring you in here with me as best I can. I've got my tumbler in there, and you'll see my 2 mounts are sticking up. So I need to drop my Z-axis down enough so that I can safely move my laser head over it, at least for now. And I'm going to do the regular steps I would with any tumbler. I'm going to make sure that the axis of my chuck is perfectly parallel with the gantry. I'm going to line, in my case, I'm going to line it up with my dead center marks on the back and the front, which let's just assume I have. And I've got to make sure it's low enough that I'm not going to have a collision with my laser head here. So we'll line up the center line, which I have, and as I come across, my tumbler is currently level, as in the unit itself is level, but I don't want it level. And courtesy of a very kind man named Robert, he's got a YouTube channel called Computer Creations. He was kind enough to do all the measurements, I guess, or the angles, and determine that in order to get the most even engrave you can, or in other words, to maintain a reasonably close focal length, you need to tilt this tumbler 3 degrees up. Because remember, right now, this part of the tumbler is much higher than this part. That's then compounded by these two mounts that are sticking up, which is why you'll see a lot of people will bend them down, which again, you know, your choice. I've tried it and I've already broken one, so I decided that was not going to work. In my case with the bolt, we have an autofocus. And this autofocus plunger is the lowest part of your laser head. And that's where you really need to be concerned. You have no choice, at least on any of the videos I've seen, other than to have to run your laser out of focus. Because if you were to autofocus, and we'll just do that right now, you'll see she's coming up. I'm going to autofocus in the center. You'll see that I'm going to have a collision. I can't run the laser. So what we want to do is we want to create our 3-degree angle on here. Let me just drop it back down for you. Run that out of the way. This is where your digital level comes in handy. It's actually magnetic as well. And we're going to create that 3-degree offset. Based on Robert's great calculations, this end of the tumbler is at the exact same height as this end. And it does work, I've measured it. So now we have more or less the best even slope we can get. In this case, you have to use, or at least I found you need to use your 4-inch lens. You're going to be running out of focus in order to avoid any collision, which means you need a longer focal length. And the reason for that, of course, is if I run over here, you'll see I just hit it. I'm now going to need to drop my Z-axis down, which is going to put my lens out of focus by several millimeters in order to make sure I don't have a collision, to the point where I can safely run back and forth without hitting it. So I'm now a little bit out of focus, but I have a longer focal length, which means that I'm going to have to run at a higher power and most likely a lower speed in order to get the material engraved or removed off of this end all the way through down the slope to the other end. And I'm avoiding a collision. So this is why quite often you'll see folks will wrap the tumbler with masking tape, because you're going to do a test first, especially if it's the first time you've either done a full wrap on a big one or it's the first time you're using that particular design. Because you're not going to use your settings. You're going to run it at a very high speed, super low power so that you don't burn through the masking tape. And they're going to do a dry run just to see whether or not their seam comes together, i.e. whether they needed to use taper warp for that particular design or not, and whether or not they get a successful burn from top to bottom, no collision, running that out of focus. But here's where you kind of have to invest in a little bit of lost inventory. At some point you have to take the masking tape off because you have to create settings. You're trying to create settings in which you know you're going to get a reasonably even or good quality burn right across this varying shape on the tumbler. But you're doing these as a production unit. So once you've done your initial settings, you've got that out of focus power and speed and LPI that's going to work for you repeatedly. I do, as I've done in the last few videos, I create a production file. I'm going to save that final design with its exact dimensions, and I'm going to use a tool layer. I'm going to write myself a note, and I'm going to put a note in it telling me it's a full wrap for a 40 ounce. I'm going to identify in the file, just in writing, I'm just going to use my text tool, and I'm going to identify what the height and the width was for this full wrap. I'm also going to identify and record what the exact diameters were, and I'm going to record how many millimeters up I had to take myself out of focus so as not to collide. And my power settings, of course, as always, I keep them in my material library separately, so you'll see it'll say Grosche tumbler, 40 ounce, 4.5 inch lens, engrave, and there's my settings. But once it's done and set as a production file, that means you can confidently grab one of these very expensive tumblers. These 40 ounces are not cheap. And whenever you're rerunning that design, you have all of your notes from your testing saved right in your production file. And then you should be able to pull it up anytime or repeatedly, hit your settings, put your tumbler in, get it on its 3 degrees, reset your 4-inch X many millimeters above your highest point, and successfully run it time and time again. Last thing I promised to talk about, the magic eraser. I know I've mentioned it in the past on other videos, but if your settings are really well defined, your cleanup should be a 30-40 second process, and you should need nothing more than the Dawn Power Wash and a sponge. If you have to start scrubbing with something harsher, such as a magic eraser, you're going to start to damage the powder coat. And if you're not sure I'm telling you the truth, you start using one, you'll find that the color of the powder coat begins to come off in the magic eraser. And the reason that color is coming off is because it's a harsh scrubby pad, and it's starting to take the powder coat off of that brand new tumbler. That's why I try never to use one. If I can't get this thing clean just with soap and a sponge, then I go back and I continue working on my settings. I try never to use anything harsher than that Dawn Power Wash. So I hope that kind of encompasses all of the questions that I've had over the last few weeks. As it appears, there's a lot of folks that are more and more interested in doing tumblers or drinkware. The method or the process I use on various different types or shapes of tumblers may not be the most efficient, especially when it comes to Lightburn, but it gets the job done for me, and it's what I've learned so far. If you are new to using your laser or working on drinkware or tumblers, I hope there was some information there that was helpful for you, and I appreciate you hanging out today. Have a great week out there. Have fun with your laser. Please be kind to each other, and I'll see you again on the next one. I'm Gord Potter, and you've been watching Laser Nug. Cheers. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about circular logos or circles or round shapes on your tumblers. Here I have a circular logo. If I was going to include this logo in with this design here, probably not that big, before I taper warp the design, I need to make sure I adjust the size or the width primarily of this circle or this round shape. And the reason why is if I don't, you will see after you finish your engrave, that circle becomes more of an oblong shape. It won't come out looking circular. On a linear surface or plane, it is in fact correct, and it is circular. But remember that when you're engraving on a tumbler or on drinkware, that drinkware is convex. So through your testing, you're going to find that depending on how big the diameter or the taper is on that tumbler, you're going to want to change the width of this circle before you incorporate it into your design and before you apply taper warp. And simply come up here, you want to unlock your aspect ratio, and in my case I usually provide somewhere between 5 to 10% depending on how big the tumbler is. In this case, the smaller ones we're using, I'll come here to the percentage, and only on the width I'm going to type in 105%, and now you'll see that it now looks like it's stretched or distorted, but when you actually engrave it on the tumbler, it's going to come out nice and round. I hope that's helpful.